science today. All right, my name is Dave Mango, like we said, and today we're going to talk about the cognitive neuroscience of empathy. And it says, you're a DevOps natural. So why do I say you're a DevOps natural? Well, this ability to empathize, this ability to make connections with other people is inherent in our biology. There are tens of thousands of years of evolution that have built these things into all of our bodies, into all of our brains. So after this talk, if you ever get into a situation where you're like, well, I don't know if I can make a connection with that team, I'm a little afraid of them or whatever, I want you to think back to this talk and think like, wait a second, I can do this. I know I can do this. So a little bit about me. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about all the random papers that I read over the past couple of years. I hope it comes out in some coherent form at the end. My degree from university is in a field called cognitive science, which was basically like cognitive neuropsychology and computer science. And I was lucky enough after school to go work in a neuroscience laboratory at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And I worked in a laboratory where we did a technique called functional neuroimaging. And so we were one of the first laboratories in the world to do a technique called functional magnetic resonance, where we actually used MRI machines to figure out what parts of the brain are activated during certain activities. And so a lot, or most of the studies that we're going to talk about today are things that we're using functional magnetic resonance as a way of figuring things out. And so what it turns out is different parts of our brain are active when we do different things. And our neurons need things like glucose and oxygen in order to function well. So with magnetic resonance, we look for where the blood is flowing, and the areas that are getting the most blood flow are the areas that are most active. So one of the other cool things was, I don't know if anyone knows this, but like at least back then, most of the MRI machines ran Unix. So I was like very at home there and stuff like that, and got to write a lot of C code. The other thing is, any pictures that you see in this talk that have brains on them, that's my brain. I actually, I have the data from way back then. So the other thing is we're going to talk about science, right? And science changes all the time. They say that science is built like one funeral at a time, or advances one funeral at a time. As people learn new things, the old ways die off, the new ways keep going. So if you come up to me in 2 years and you're like, well, I remember that talk that you gave, well, it turns out that theory is wrong, like, okay, that theory is wrong. Like, this is based on the latest things that we can find. And also, I like to say biology is messy. So some of these theories might be conflicting with one another. Some of them might have multiple definitions for things, because this stuff is evolving all the time. Things are always changing in science. So I'm going to try to present like the latest things that I've been able to find, and that's kind of the state of the art for what we understand. And so the human brain we've talked about for decades or hundreds of years or even longer, and people have always tried to figure out what's going on in the brain, like what is this thing for? And so the funny thing is that people used to describe the brain, or people still describe the brain, as whatever the most advanced technological thing is they can think of. So we used to talk about the brain as like being like a clock, because the clock was the most advanced thing we have. And now everybody tries to draw parallels to a computer, because we have short-term memory and long-term storage and all this other stuff. But the brain's not a computer and it's not a clock, and we've learned lots of things. And one of the things that we've learned is that different parts of the brain have different specializations. Now this like phrenology thing is probably not accurate, but the idea that different parts of the brain have different functions is kind of important. I used to work with a doctor at NIH, Mark Mentis, great guy, psychiatrist, and he was telling me that when he was in South Africa doing his rotation in medical school, he got a call. You have to come into the emergency room because somebody tried to commit suicide, they put a gun to their head, and we need you to come in. Okay, so he got there, looks around, where's my patient? I don't see anybody, there's nobody on a gurney anywhere, like what's going on? So he went up to a nurse and he's like, you guys called me to come in here, like what's going on? And they said, oh, that's your patient over there in the corner. And there was a person standing up in the corner with a whole crowd of doctors and nurses around him, and everybody is laughing their heads, well, not their heads off, but they're laughing like crazy. And it turns out when this person had tried to hurt themselves, they had damaged their frontal lobes. And one of the things that your frontal lobes does is it inhibits your decision to say inappropriate things in inappropriate situations. Well, he didn't have any of these inhibitions anymore and was telling really disgusting, dirty jokes to everybody in the room. And so they're all laughing because he didn't know any better. Kind of tells us that like different parts of the brain have very specific functions and very interesting things that they can do. So back in the early 90s, which is probably a little bit after Mark Mentis' story, in a lab in Parma, Italy, and so that's Parmesan cheese on the left, so that you have a mnemonic to remember where this all happened. There was a scientist named Vittorio Gallese, and he was doing research on macaque monkeys, and they had electrodes implanted in the brains of these monkeys in an area called F5, which sort of translates to the premotor cortex in humans. And this area of the brain is responsible for, gross motor movement. And so, as the story goes, Vittorio is reaching for like a piece of fruit or something on a table, and he hears this sound, this familiar sound of a neuron firing. And this is kind of weird because they're measuring, this neural activity in these monkeys when the monkeys are performing these actions, but the monkey's not performing any action. The monkey is actually just watching Vittorio reach for this piece of fruit. So this was the discovery of what we call mirror neurons. And these mirror neurons actually fire not only when we do an activity, but when we see somebody else do an activity, the same neurons are firing, which is pretty weird, right? And so this plays really well into this idea of empathy, because when we see somebody else do something, our brains actually activate the same neural pattern. So our brains are almost experiencing the same thing that we see other people doing. And it's not just like reaching for things. These mirror neurons can mirror intention. They can mirror like grasping. They can mirror tearing. And it's not just physical things. We have mirror neurons that will mirror things that are visual. We have mirror neurons that will mirror things that are auditory. So it's kind of amazing, but this is something that's built into our biology. This is something that's always been a part of us. Grasping is something that's likely learned, but as every parent probably knows, like imitation is something that happens even in babies. If you stick your tongue out at a baby, it's very likely that that baby will stick their tongue out back at you. And we naturally build a social system between two different entities, and it's just a part of who we are. There are feedback loops that are happening between different people constantly so that we learn about each other. And scientists are now calling this the default network. It's the network of things that are activated in your brain that are constantly trying to make sense of the world around us. They're constantly trying to make sense of other people. And we can't help but do this. This is just something that's really important that sort of evolution has designed. So Andrew Schaefer is on the screen now, and I've just activated mirror neurons in everybody in the room. I don't know if you can hear it or smell it, but this is something that is just a natural part of what you're doing. So when you're looking at Andrew, like, what are his emotions? How do you know what those are? What is he thinking about? Like, how do you know what that is? And they've done experiments like this where people have done mimicking of like facial expressions like surprise and disgust. And it's activated these areas of the brain. So our brains naturally want to connect. They want to be social. Our default network spends its time trying to understand other humans, but why? Like, why would this be the thing that evolution has chosen as we're not doing anything else. I'm not trying to figure out my code. I'm not trying to understand like what the person next to me just said. I fall back to my default network. Why would I do this? Well, it's really to ensure our survival as a group. So think about it this way. If I have a group of monkeys and they're sitting around and every night the tiger comes to take one of the monkeys and all the other monkeys are like, well, it's taking that monkey, that's not me, so everything's cool, and they let the monkey get taken away by the tiger, eventually there are not going to be any monkeys left. But if the tiger comes in the middle of the night to take a monkey and all the monkeys fight off that tiger, now we've ensured the survival of the group. Now we've made sure that all the monkeys survive, and that's really important to us. And this desire of our brains to connect with other people, to make these connections, is so deep that we look for connection anywhere we can find it. And so they did these experiments in like the 1940s. Whoops, wrong way. These experiments in the 1940s, and they showed people these shapes. And these shapes are moving around on the screen. And they asked people to describe what's going on in the movie. And people say crazy things. They're like, well, that big bad triangle is doing this, and that poor circle, and why is he picking on him, and blah, blah. And they're ascribing intention to these shapes. These are paper cutouts that are moving around on a screen. But our brains want to look for meaning in whatever we can find, and so we anthropomorphize all this stuff. Which this movie is like, oh no! I'll show you the final conclusion later. And so there's this great quote about empathy from Matthew Lieberman, and I'll let you read it for a few seconds, and then we'll discuss it in greater depth. Okay, so we have a much more advanced model of empathy that goes beyond just simple mirror neurons. And the mirror neurons are important in this model of empathy. The mirror neurons will be at the top in what's called experience sharing. There's other names for this in the literature. People call it emotional contagion. People call it shared feelings. But it's the idea that like we experience things internally that we recognize other people experience. But there's other components of this model that are important for empathy. The bottom right here, we have pro-social concern. Pro-social concern is basically this idea that like we're forming a goal to help other people. So it's also called emotional concern, but it's this idea that like if I see somebody else like in a situation where they might need help and I'm not motivated to do anything about it, that's not empathy. Just recognizing what somebody else is doing isn't empathy. We actually have to want to do something about it. So if I'm a developer and all the operations people were up all night fighting something that I checked in, but I don't feel like I need to do anything about that, then I'm not going to feel, that's not empathy. That's, a recognition of things. And this pro-social concern, it turns out to be like a really important part of this empathy model. And the other thing to note about this before we talk about mentalizing is that these things are not in equal proportion. Different kinds of empathy will actually emphasize different parts of this model. So there are things that we're going to want to do to actually highlight certain parts of this. Mentalizing is one of the things I find most fascinating from like a philosophical perspective and stuff like that. But mentalizing is this idea that we detect a mind in other people. And so without understanding that somebody else has a mind, there's another part of empathy that we're not going to actually have this complete model. And so the scientist Lear Hackle says, when we empathize with someone, we must first detect a mind that can feel pain. So if we don't recognize that somebody else is human and has a mind, and we think of them more as like some other object in our space, then we're not actually going to be able to feel empathy for them. And so as a way of testing this idea of mentalizing, this theory of mind about other people, they do something called the Sally-Ann test, or it's also called the false belief paradigm. And in the Sally-Ann test, subjects are watching a puppet show. And in the puppet show, there's Sally and there's Ann, and they're best friends, and they play, and they do all kinds of fun stuff. And at some point, Sally decides she's going to go for a walk. And so the marble that Sally and Ann have been playing with, Sally takes, and she puts it in her box. And then she goes and she leaves the stage and she goes and does whatever she wants to do on her walk. And when Sally leaves, Ann goes over to the box, takes the marble out, and puts it in Ann's box. And then then Sally comes back from her walk. She had a great time. And they ask the subject, well, where is Sally going to look for the marble? It turns out if you are on the autism spectrum or you're under the age of 4, you're going to say that Sally is going to look in Anne's box for the marble, because you don't have the ability to recognize that Sally can have a distinct mind of her own that is separate from yours. You think that part of what Sally is experiencing is what you're experiencing because you can't recognize that distinction. You don't recognize that she has her own theory about the world, so you're going to think that they're going to look in Anne's box. And for most of us, we'll recognize that Sally is, going to look in Sally's box because she doesn't know any better. And so this ability to mentalize about other people's mental states or understand that their mental states, I find kind of fascinating, because one of the things we talk about a lot in DevOps are these cognitive biases. And if you've seen like Lindsay Homewood's talk or Nigel Kirsten, they both give great talks about cognitive biases. But one of my favorite cognitive biases is the fundamental attribution error, right? And in the fundamental attribution error, we have this idea that like, if I do something, it's because it's situational. If somebody else does something, it's because it's inherent to who they are. So like, I had a bad day, I had too much coffee, my slides didn't work, my kid tripped on his way to school, whatever. That's the reason that I did something bad. If somebody else does it, they're a jerk, they're always like that, blah, blah, blah. It's this false cognitive bias. But the reason that we have this bias is because we use our default network, and our default network's tendency is to adopt an intentional stance towards other people. We believe that it's fundamentally a part of their character to do this. It's their fundamental disposition as opposed to being situational. And it turns out that when they've done studies on this fundamental attribution error, people engage an area of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex. And so the medial prefrontal cortex, yes, that is my brain, is part of this default network. And these are different other parts of the default network because it's a network. It's not just a specific area of the brain. This is missing like temporal parietal junction, a couple of things. But that's great. So we know we have this ability to understand other people. But in DevOps, I work on a team. And my team has to work with other teams. So what do we know about empathizing at a group or team level? So we know one thing is we mentalize about groups in the same ways that we mentalize about individuals. So our ability to attribute mindfulness to others works at a group level as well. We know that out-of-group members evoke less activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. So we actually empathize less with people we don't consider close to us. So if I'm on the operations team, I have a much better ability to empathize and be mindful about the people on my team than I do about, say, network engineering or QA or whatever. Like the people that are close to us, we recognize this mindfulness in. We have a lower threshold to mind perception for people in our in-group. So this is just naturally something that we do, unless the out-group members are considered a threat, and hopefully nobody considers anyone else in their company a threat. But, if people are coming after you with a knife, like, you attribute a lot of intention to that. Like, it's not some random thing that's happening. Like, those people have a mind, and they're coming after you. And so this is why silos are bad in our organizations, right? This is why cross-functional teams work really well. Because we don't want other people to be considered an out-group. We want everyone to be considered an in-group, right? If we look at Gene Kim's first way of DevOps, like it's optimizing the entire system, like we want everyone to be in an in-group. We want everyone to be working towards like the same kinds of things. So this team stuff is actually really fascinating, and this in-group. And so yeah, there's the I in team. But so there's a theory called the common in-group identity model that's being advanced by Gertner and Davidio about how teams work together. And one fundamental component of this model is what they call the contact hypothesis. And so the contact hypothesis says that contact with out-group members is beneficial to attitudes about the out-group, which makes sense. If we work with people in other teams, we are going to do better working with people in other teams. But they have very specific situations where this is going to happen, the things that are going to make this work best. So number one, the teams have to have equal status. Number two, the teams have to have common goals. Does this sound like DevOps to anybody? Number three, they have to be in a cooperative or interdependent setting. And number four, they have to have support from what they call authorities, but what I would call management. And for me, like, this is a blueprint for how do we get like teams to work together. We have to put them in a situation where they're best able to actually succeed, and they have to have all these components. So that's kind of cool, but that's kind of how things work on a group level. But what about on an individual level? What about between people? So Jonathan Swift's quote is, "It's useless to attempt to reason a man out of a thing he was never reasoned into." And so I'd say that the gentleman who's here from the Canadian government, he calls this hearts and minds, right? Much better to appeal to the heart than appeal to the mind. So we don't want to just talk to people about like how we're the same. We actually want to show them. And so my friend Walter, I've worked with at many different companies. He's a great guy. And I was talking to Walter about, hey, we're going to put on this DevOps conference, and I want you to come, and I want your team to be involved. And he's like, I don't know, Dave. Like, I've heard a lot about this DevOps stuff. I don't really understand it yet, but like, you know, I don't think that my team's really going to go for this stuff. Like, one of the things I heard about DevOps is that developers have to be on call. And I got to tell you, my team isn't going to want to get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I said, Walter, my team doesn't want to get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning either. And he's like, oh. He's like, I get it. Okay, we'll be at your conference. But, you know, I could have appealed to like medial prefrontal cortex and all kinds of things to him, but instead, it was like just going with empathy, like showing him like, hey, we're both in the same in-group together. And so I think it's kind of fascinating that these connections that are made in our brains are, you know, they're real. They're real things that are happening. And so there's a lot of literature in empathy research about pain. And so unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know what you want to call it, like pain is really easy to do in a laboratory, whereas like humor or laughter or happiness, like it's a little different. But like if you give someone an electrical shock, like that's real. Like you'll actually, that's something that you can measure. And so, sorry. So this brain researcher, Tanya Singer, did one of the most famous experiments with mirror neurons in pain. And what she did is she was trying to sort of kind of replicate some of these earlier mirror neuron studies. And she took women and she put them inside a functional magnetic resonance situation in an MRI machine. And she had their boyfriends outside the machine. And the women could see the boyfriends, and they were obviously in the machine. And they did scanning of their brains during this experiment. And in the experiment, one of two people would get the electric shock. Either the woman inside the scanner would get the shock, or the boyfriend would get the shock. And the weirdest thing is, no matter who got the shock, the women activated the same pain distress network in their brains. This dorsal anterior cingulate cortex part of their brain was lit up whether the boyfriend got the shock or they got the shock. These women could actually say to their boyfriends with a straight face, I feel your pain. So this is real, like this ability to empathize with other people, like it's real inside of us. And it's so real, the fact that even though we didn't feel the physical pain, but we actually experience it, that they did another experiment that they call cyberball. And in cyberball, they do this thing where the subject lies in the scanner and they're told, you're going to play this game over the internet with people who are in other scanners, and we're going to like see how group dynamics work over the internet and cooperation and all this stuff. But what happens in cyberball is the patient who's in the scanner like is playing with these other probably avatars, not even real people, but for a while. And at some point, the other two stop throwing them the ball. And they're left out. They're rejected. And the same areas of their brain, these pain receptor areas, this dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, is lit up. They feel real psychological and physical, right, pain when they're rejected. The weirdest thing is they did this experiment where there was a placebo group and there was a group on like Tylenol, on like painkillers. And the people who were on the painkillers had reduced activation in their dorsal anterior cingulate cortex when they had this rejection. So it's showing you that like this pain is real, like it's actually, you know, a thing that's tangible. And so we don't want to talk about it in terms of pain with DevOps, but like on the flip side, we can do like really important things in our DevOps journey. So Matthew Lieberman, who had that quote earlier, he says, positive social regard is a renewable resource. Rather than having less of something after using it, when we let others know that we value them, both parties have more. So that's what we need to do on our teams. We need to give this positive reinforcement to other people. We need to say, I really appreciated it when you did this. It was really awesome. We need to activate those like opioid and dopaminergic receptors in other people's brains because it's cheap, it's easy, it's free to us. But like building those connections with other people is really important. And so those last slide we're going to talk about is we don't necessarily want to drive experience sharing like across. That's not necessarily the component of this empathy model that we want. If all of operations is miserable, we don't want all of development to be miserable. That is some degree of empathy, but that's not like what we're going for here. Or that's one way. That could probably be like getting people in a certain direction. But what we want to do is we want to drive this pro-social concern that we talked about. And this turns out to be like really important for healthcare workers because like nurses and doctors don't want to go home like super upset every night. But what they need to develop is this empathy of pro-social concern. We want to create more in-groups between people. And so the stress thing is interesting because decisions directly after stress revealed increased generosity towards socially close but not distant others. So if you're in a stressful situation, you're going to fall back to your team. You're going to fall back to your in-group members. And that's where you're going to look for support. I don't know if everyone's read the paper or that came out in the New York Times about the Google teams and being successful and this idea of like psychological safety, right? Those are the people that we're going to go to. If we have a team that we can go to for psychological safety, that's how we deal with stressful situations, and that's how the team is supportive of each other. And in Google's case, it turns out those are, the highest performing teams. We know that the emotional contagion of pain in humans occurs in friends, but not in strangers. So we are more likely, we talked about earlier, for in-group members, we're more likely to be able to mentalize about them, but we're also more likely to have this emotional contagion between the two of us, this experience sharing. And the last part of this is stress reduction in humans can elicit emotional contagion of pain in strangers. So reduced stress, increased ability to empathize. So I don't know if people have heard about, like John Willis has been talking about like burnout. There was a session yesterday, a breakout session about mental health issues. What we need to do is, the first thing we need to do is take care of ourselves. We need to make sure that we're in a good place, that we don't get burned out, because burnout inhibits empathy. And burnout inhibiting empathy means burnout inhibits DevOps. So we don't want that. So we want to do everything we can to create more in-group between different groups in our company, different people that we work with. We're going to get more performance out of that. And just like in that common in-group identity model, like we're going to just be able to function at a higher level when we work with other people. So that's it. Thank you. And so if you're really interested in this stuff, this is selected bibliography. There's tons of stuff to dig into. And then I think I'm pretty close to out of time. So if you want to get in touch with me, I'm at Dave Mango on Twitter. And
sorry, did you want to take questions?
I'll take questions if people are into it.
It sounded like you didn't want to, so that's why.
Oh, no. You were up here, so I was like, oh, okay.
No, I'm sorry.
I don't know. I feel some empathy.
Yeah.
Sure. It's a great question. And so what it turns out is that people who spend time together, as you would imagine, like are closer. And then, my perfect example of this is Slack, right? And I love Slack. I'm on Slack all the time. It's great, but one of the things with Slack is that you're missing all kinds of things that would activate your mirror neurons. because I'm not seeing the person. I'm not even hearing things that could actually give me clues about like their mental state. It's tough. It's tough over that thing. And so my sort of answer to that is very much like, if your senior management thinks that on-sites are not valuable, like they're completely wrong. Like we need to have those on-sites. We need to get people together periodically, because there's a lower threshold to mind perception if we actually understand the other people. So if I'm remote and I know somebody, you know, very well that I'm communicating with over Slack, I'm going to have much better ability to fill in those gaps based on the fact that I know them. Whereas like, if it's somebody you've never met, you've never talked to, whatever, it's very difficult to kind of build that mental relationship between two people.
How far do you think you really push like in-group expansion?
Well, that's funny, right? There's what's that magic number, the 150, like Dunbar's number? Thank you. I think that because this is part of our biology, I think that it's pretty large. You know, you look at like your Facebook or whatever, like there's a lot. Sometimes you look at the number, you're like, oh, there's a lot more people on there than I would have expected or whatever. But I think that because like we have tens of thousands of years of trying to build these relationships, obviously like there's a certain amount of maintenance that's required for a relationship between two people. But I think that even a small amount of sort of familiarity between people will lower that threshold to mind perception, which would, you know, increase our medial prefrontal cortex activation. So I think that any of it is good. Obviously, like you're going to have, no matter what, the people who are closer to you, you're going to have just a different experience with. But I think the number is probably pretty large.
Are you familiar with how coalition behavior and status interact?
I'm not really sure what that is.
Okay.
That's cool.
What happened to the little circle?
No, I'm sure we can pull that up. Whoa, there's some chat right there. Yeah, I think I think that's just part one of like a trilogy of important. And the sequel is never as good as the first. Cool. All right. Well, I'll be around all day, and you can hit me on Twitter. Thank you.